HighBridge Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Story of Us, a new look at human evolution, by Lesley Newson and Peter J. Richardson, read by Mike Cooper. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and ebook formats of the book. 1. Getting Beyond the Ape Men. What is it to be human? With your first breath, you begin your lifelong exploration of this question. You slowly tried to work out how to be comfortable in your body and the world around you. You needed others to care for you, and you automatically behaved in ways that encouraged them to care. Your eyes were attracted to their faces, and you stared back into their eyes. Your lips stretched themselves into little smiles. You cried when you felt uncomfortable. Your life has been intertwined with the lives of other people from the moment you were conceived. Scientists want to understand how our species evolved because they believe it will shed light on the question of what it is to be human. Speculation about human evolution has been going on for over 150 years, but it wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that stories of human evolution began to be told to the general public. The scientists telling these stories had very little evidence to go on, just a few fragments of human-like bones and teeth that archaeologists had found. But they thought they understood enough about people to put together a good story. They confidently described ape men fighting over women and territory on the African savanna. It was a story that made sense to people who had recently experienced a devastating war and felt a little uncomfortable talking about sex in polite company. Talking about our animal ancestors' sex lives was acceptable, but still a little titillating. The world has moved on since these days, but the ape men stories didn't change much. By the 1990s, scientists were less interested in how the ape men fought and more interested in how they thought. The stories told by these evolutionary psychologists were still about ape men in the savannah, but these ape men were processing information and calculating how to defend territory and get the most females. In recent years, scientists have released a torrent of new information about what our ancestors were like and how they lived their lives. It's now possible to tell a bigger, bolder, and richer story of human evolution. And our purpose in writing this book is to tell such a story. When we were in the final stages of writing it, world events provided a new demonstration of why a new story is needed. In a matter of days, people found their lives dramatically changed as population after population attempted to slow the spread of a new virus. Many people were compelled to stay at home to reduce their risk of catching the virus, while others were asked to risk infection and go to work, caring for the sick and supporting those sheltering at home. Scientists with relevant expertise worked at trying to better understand the virus and its spread, and to find ways of treating and/or preventing infections. There was talk of national emergencies and being at war, but this was a different kind of war. It wasn't a war of one group of humans against another group. Instead, all humans were urged to unite to confront a common enemy, the virus. Efforts to fight this invisible enemy were often shambolic, and any unity achieved was far from perfect. But the global response to this virus in 2020 was very different from what would have happened if a virus like this had emerged in the middle of the 20th century. Most 21st century people expected, and hoped, that humans would work together, not only to defeat the virus, but also to protect the complex social and economic bonds of our shared world. Our story of human evolution explains how the descendants of apes living in an African forest could have evolved into the kind of animal that behaves like this. It's not a complete story, far from it, and without doubt, future investigations will turn up evidence that reveals new details. These may support or challenge parts of this story. That's how science works. But our story is certainly truer and more complete than the old ape men stories. Also, It's long past time to tell a story that weaves in the new evidence and also talks about all the interesting things that women and children were doing as human beings evolved. New ways of thinking about thinking. When humans puzzle over something abstract like what is thinking, we can't help but draw on our experiences with the concrete, everyday world. Once scientists started using computers, they began to conceive of thinking as being like computing. They started to see a brain as a data processing and storage device like a computer. Since then, ideas about brain evolution have closely tracked the development of computers. In the 1990s, scientists shared their offices with a desktop computer that had a floppy disk drive and a chunky monitor. They were excited about the performance of their new PC clone with a Pentium chip and a Windows 95 operating system. So when scientists in the 1990s thought about how the brain evolved, they were inclined to think about hardware upgrades, imagining improvements in things like processing speed and storage capacity. They saw genes as being like programs and natural selection as being like a software designer. Computers have changed a lot in the past 25 years. Computer networks were rudimentary in the 1990s. The explosive growth of the Internet and the proliferation of connected devices changed everything. It also gave us a much better metaphor for how the human brain works. Networked mobile computers can do much more than the desktop computer of the 1990s. This isn't just because they're better at storing and handling data. What's really important is their ability to share data, programs, and processing power. The connectedness of today's computers has helped scientists to realize that the computer inside the human skull also owes much of its power to its ability to be in a network, to be part of an us. We humans learn from each other. We put our heads together and think things over. We share our feelings and feel each other's pain. Connectedness is vital for our mental health. Children who have been neglected and not allowed social contact don't just grow up ignorant of the world, their brain development is often delayed or impaired. Our ability and our need to be connected evolved because being connected made our ancestors successful. The stories of human evolution that we share and tell our children need to change to reflect this new understanding. But even more important, they need to reflect all the new evidence about our ancestors that doesn't fit into the violent ape-men on the savannah story. For example, we now know much more about what our female ancestors were doing and what children's lives were like. This is in no small part due to the many brilliant women scientists who have risen through the academic ranks to positions that allow them to influence research topics. Knowing more about children's lives is vitally important for understanding human evolution, because it's during childhood that the competition for survival is most acute. Even 100 years ago, it was common in some populations for half the babies to die before reaching adulthood. We must never forget that, over the millennia, our ancestors were the ones who not only made it to adulthood, but also had children who made it to adulthood and went on to have children themselves. You might think that there's nothing complicated or special about humans raising their young. Producing offspring is, after all, something all animals do. But this view is deceptive. In evolutionary terms, producing offspring that survive is the most important thing animals do. In most species of mammal, the female does all the work of raising the young. In humans, mothers get help and support from other women and from the men in their lives. Whether they were hunters, farmers, soldiers, or something else, men's work was important for our evolution because it contributed to the survival of children. A key and recurring theme in the story of human evolution is how men's efforts have been harnessed and applied to the raising of offspring. Today's evolutionary scientists are also less keen to try to learn about a gene-defined human nature. In fact, the whole human nature idea is looking more and more bogus. Awkward family gatherings may be difficult to endure, but they provide ideal opportunities to observe that people who are raised together and share a lot of the same genes don't necessarily behave in the same way. Neither genes nor environment do a good job of predicting how our children will turn out. Neither factor, alone or in combination, can explain why a challenge that makes one child resilient can scar another child for life. There is other stuff going on to make us what we are, including random factors. We may have to accept, like our ancestors did, that some stuff just happens. Call it luck or fate. Not all the influences in our lives can be pinned down and explained. Humans haven't evolved a mind programmed to respond in certain ways. We evolved a mind that could evolve, and it has made us what we are today. A very different animal. Stories are tools for thinking, and so is evidence. 7 million years ago, our ancestors were apes that lived in forests in Africa. These apes are also the ancestors of the chimpanzees and bonobos that still live in Africa today. While their side of the family stayed put, our ancestors left the forest and produced descendants that eventually became scattered all over the world. The paths our ancestors took over the last 7 million years are being investigated by legions of scientists, and their work is revealing more and more details. Evidence is always better at showing what could not have happened than revealing for certain what did happen. That's why stories are valuable. By pulling together threads of evidence from many disciplines, it's possible to weave together ideas about the dramas that our ancestors might have starred in. We can even make educated guesses about what it felt like to be them. It was the challenges they faced, the solutions they found, and the trade-offs they made that shaped what we have become. To understand our ancestors, it's not enough to simply imagine how we might have faced those challenges or how we might have felt. We must think ourselves outside of the time and place we live in now. Our ancestors didn't just face different problems, they had lifetimes of different experiences and were steeped in different knowledge and beliefs. Our more ancient ancestors were physically different, and their minds had different capacities. They weren't capable of thinking and feeling like we do. And even quite recent ancestors, who may have looked just like people today, would have thought and felt differently. Humans have long used stories to launch their imagination into situations they could never experience in their own lives. That's why this book is illustrated with stories about events that could have taken place in our ancestors' lives. All scientists are storytellers, constantly using their imagination to try to make sense of the evidence they're gathering. The stories others have told are the inspiration for the ones we've written for this book. The foundations of our ancestors' evolutionary success were laid during their childhood, when their lives were most at risk. So our stories are mostly set in this part of their lives. Our ancestors didn't just survive the dangers, they were also able to make the most of the situations they found themselves in. The stories we tell get longer as the evolutionary process brings increasing complexity to our ancestors' lives, and each one is followed by a summary of the evidence and theories that we drew on to write the story. We've written the book in a multi-level way, because we believe that stories of our origins belong to all humans, not just to those who are trained in science or fascinated by it. Many people would rather not be told a story about humans being animals and a product of the evolutionary process described by Charles Darwin. People's reactions to Darwin's ideas provide a good illustration of the diversity of our species. Some of us see it as obviously true that humans evolved by natural selection, survival of the fittest, and believe this view to be well supported by evidence. Others reject the idea, see it as obviously false, and quote plenty of evidence to show why it can't be true. Both sides have a point. The close connectedness of humans and our reliance on one another is convincing evidence that human evolution wasn't just a matter of survival of the fittest. Darwin saw that too. Humans may be animals, but we aren't just another animal. The evolution of an animal like us is so unlikely that scholars have puzzled and argued for a long time over how it could have happened. An animal like us could only have evolved in certain very unusual circumstances. This means that if humans are a product of evolution, we can rule out a lot of scenarios about our past that can't possibly be true. In developing the story of our evolution, we must imagine the kinds of things that might have happened to make the evolution of an animal like us possible. The story of our evolution is amazing and unique. We humans have a history we can be proud of. Well, maybe not all of it. The special species. Nowadays, many people believe there's nothing special about humans, that we're just another animal. This wasn't the case in 1858, when Charles Darwin presented his idea of evolution by natural selection. His book, On the Origin of Species, published the following year, was a bestseller for a non-fiction book, and readers were impressed by the large body of evidence he had pulled together. Even so, a lot of them struggle with the basic idea. It seemed to strip life of its meaning and purpose, except for some all-consuming need to compete, survive, and leave offspring. They didn't feel that this was what their lives were all about. This feeling, or need for a feeling, that our lives are about something, is one of the things that is special about humans. Darwin went on to write The Descent of Man in 1871, another great book, but it left most of his critics unsatisfied. Alfred Russel Wallace believed that understanding human specialness required looking beyond the physical world. Like Darwin, Wallace was a 19th century British naturalist and explorer with a beard. He spent much of the early part of his life exploring in the tropics, observing the animals, plants, and people who lived there. Like Darwin, he collected many specimens and sent them back to England. It was in 1858, when he was 34 years old and exploring the islands that are now part of Indonesia, that he worked out the theory of evolution by natural selection. Like most well-read English men and women of his time, Wallace was familiar with the evidence that the Earth and its life had changed or evolved over time. There were fossilized remains of strange plants and animals that no longer existed. More and more of these remains were being found all the time. What's more, remains of sea creatures were often found embedded in rock on the tops of mountains, hundreds of miles from the coast. What force or forces were driving these changes? Wallace enjoyed puzzling over such questions with friends and colleagues. It was when he was recovering from malaria, and perhaps a little feverish, that he realized that there didn't need to be a supernatural force driving the change in living organisms. The struggle for survival could be that force. This struggle was something Wallace witnessed all the time as he explored the tropical islands. When living things reproduced, they created far more offspring than could possibly survive, so there was constant competition. Animals competed to find food, trees competed to get their leaves into the sunlight, and everything tried to avoid being food for something else. Individual organisms were not all the same, and some had characteristics that made them better suited to the environment. They were the ones most likely to survive long enough to reproduce. If the offspring of these survivors inherit their parents' characteristics, then the population of organisms is bound to change with each generation. The new generation will be slightly better suited to the environment than the previous one. As soon as he was well enough, Wallace wrote to Charles Darwin explaining his idea. He and Darwin had been exchanging letters for 2 years, but Wallace didn't know that Darwin had already had the same idea. Back in England, Darwin had been quietly developing his theory about how competition to survive and leave offspring could be a natural mechanism for evolution. He had talked about it with close friends, but didn't want to discuss it more widely until he had built up a good body of evidence and examples to show that it was more than just a notion. Once he realized that someone else was thinking along the same lines, he arranged for Wallace's letter, along with a paper of his own, to be read at a meeting of the Linnean Society of London in 1858. At that time, the Linnean Society was one of the primary organizations discussing new discoveries in natural history, and by having the idea presented in this way, Darwin ensured that both he and Wallace would be credited with thinking of it. Still in Indonesia, Wallace knew nothing of this, but he eventually received letters telling him what a stir the idea was causing among naturalists. He continued his exploration of the islands for another 4 years, returning to England in 1862 to find that everyone interested in evolution was discussing Darwin's Origin of Species, which had been out for over 2 years. There's no evidence that Wallace had any grievance with Darwin about how he and his idea had been treated. In fact, he began to give public lectures explaining his and Darwin's shared view of how natural selection could have created the vast diversity of life. It soon became clear, however, that Wallace's view of human evolution differed from Darwin's in an important way. Wallace believed that the evolution of the physical characteristics of living things could have come about through millions of generations of organisms competing to survive. But he couldn't see how the consciousness and the conscience of humans could have come about in this way. In his travels, he had seen countless examples of animals and plants competing. He had observed many times the suffering and death of creatures with an injury or illness that had made them less able to survive. A small wound or slight malaise was often fatal. This was far less likely in the humans that Wallace had observed. During his travels in South America and Indonesia, he had met many peoples whom his friends back in Europe would call savages. The various tribes looked and behaved very differently from Europeans, and also very differently from each other, but he found that all the humans he met were the same in an important way. In an essay he wrote for the Journal of the Anthropological Society of London, he described it like this: "In the rudest tribes, the sick are assisted at least with food. Less robust health and vigour than the average does not entail death. Neither does the want of perfect limbs or other organs produce the same effects as among animals. Some division of labour takes place. The swiftest hunt, the less active fish or gather fruits. Food is to some extent exchanged or divided. The action of natural selection is therefore checked. The weaker, the dwarfish, those of less active limbs or less piercing eyesight, do not suffer the extreme penalty which falls upon animals so defective." Wallace concluded that humans don't compete like other animals, and that this meant natural selection would not work in the same way as it did with other living things. He also wondered what would account for the generosity that seemed to be universal in humans, and yet, he thought, completely absent in other animals. He speculated that human evolution might be different, and that some other evolutionary process might be necessary to explain the development of the moral beliefs and mental life of humans. He wondered if this evolution could be occurring outside of the immediately observable physical world. And why not? Up in Scotland, the physicist James Clerk Maxwell was demonstrating that electric and magnetic fields travel through space as invisible waves, moving at the speed of light. So much of what had been thought of as supernatural was becoming understood to be part of nature. There was a sense that many amazing new discoveries were just around the corner. In the 1860s, there was much discussion of the possibility that an invisible spirit world might also be part of nature. Wallace, like a number of scientists at the time, believed that if such a world did exist, the possibility of communicating with spirits should be systematically investigated. He thought that, in spirit form, the human mind might evolve separately from a physical body. Wallace attended some séances and heard knocking alleged to be made by disembodied spirits. He spoke to his dead relatives through mediums, and he even had his photograph taken with an apparition of his dead mother. Some of the people who produced such supernatural phenomena later admitted that they were frauds. Even so, Wallace remained convinced that some of the communications he'd had with the spirit world were genuine. Nowadays, Darwin is given most of the credit for developing the theory of evolution by natural selection because of the huge amount of work he did to present evidence to support the theory. Today's scientists admire Darwin for his determination to be guided by that evidence rather than the fashionable ideas of his time. Darwin didn't think much of the spirit world idea, but he completely agreed with Wallace that explaining human evolution presented a problem. They both believed that all living things are related and that it's possible to compile a great family tree of life. Gaps in this family tree were constantly being filled in during Darwin's lifetime as his colleagues explored the world, finding more living specimens and fossils of organisms that had died out. Many more gaps have been filled in since Darwin's time. Our new ability to sequence the DNA of living organisms, and in some cases DNA recovered from the remains of long-dead organisms, is making a big contribution as well. Biologists are now able to more precisely position the many limbs and branches of the tree of life. Darwin saw that humans had a place on the tree, even if our species had to be put way out on a limb. It must have irritated him that popular writers of the time misquoted him as claiming that humans are descended from monkeys. Darwin put humans on the same branch of the tree as the great apes of Africa, chimpanzees and gorillas, and believed us to be more distantly related to another kind of great ape, the orangutan, found on the Indonesian islands of Borneo and Sumatra. Monkeys are more distant relatives. Their faces may look human-like, but their bodies are very different. Most of them have a tail, for example. Darwin lived long before anyone knew anything of DNA or genes, or how characteristics are passed from parents to offspring. His judgments were based on painstaking observations, both his own and those of his naturalist colleagues. DNA analyses have shown these judgments to be mostly correct. Darwin's determination to base his judgments on evidence made his views about human evolution, which he published in 1871, less popular than his earlier book on the origin of species. At the time, his views were less influential than those of some other scholars. Herbert Spencer was the celebrity pundit for human evolution. Spencer wasn't just very eloquent, he also seemed to be very sensitive to what the public wanted to hear. Darwin disagreed with Spencer and many others who justified their countrymen's treatment of non-Europeans with the claim that other races are inferior or somehow less human. Darwin argued that the physical differences between peoples are so superficial that a biologist must conclude that not only do all humans belong to the same species, but that we are all closely related. He agreed that people raised in different environments behave differently, but he argued that experiences influence behavior. In his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, he presented evidence that when young people from different parts of the world spend time in Europe and are encouraged to adopt European ways, they behave just like Europeans. Darwin gained first-hand experience of this thanks to his 5-year voyage around the world on the British naval vessel called HMS Beagle. He spent quite a bit of time with a young man whom the English called Jemmy Button. Darwin and Button were on the Beagle together when the 90-foot-long, 242-ton bark set sail from England in 1829, crammed with 73 people and the provisions and equipment they would need for the first part of their journey. The main purpose of the journey was to survey South America to make more detailed maps of its coast. Darwin, aged 22, was going along to be the ship's naturalist. His job was to disembark and explore the land as the Beagle sailed along the coasts. He planned to collect specimens of plants, animals and rocks and send them back to England. Jemmy Button was on the Beagle to be taken back to his homeland. On the ship's previous voyage to South America 2 years earlier, the captain had picked up, kidnapped, 4 natives and decided to take them back to England. Button was one of the 3 that survived. Living with English people had transformed him. When the Beagle crew first encountered him, he was a scrawny child swimming naked with his friends in the near-freezing seawater that surrounded the ship. By the time Darwin met him, he was a rather plump teenager, dressed in the latest London fashion, with perfect table manners and the Christian values of the English people he had lodged with. The captain hoped that, once back with his people, he would be able to teach them Christianity and the civilized ways he had learned in England. After many adventures...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?